In the winter of 1931, a county clerk in rural Virginia opened a filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in 40 years. Inside, she found birth certificates that made her hands shake. The same surnames appeared over and over, mothers who were also cousins, fathers who were also uncles. 15 generations of names circling back on themselves like a serpent eating its own tail. She locked the cabinet, walked out of the courthouse, and never returned to work. What she'd discovered wasn't just a family tree. It was a testimony to something that should have been impossible. Something that, once begun, became impossible to stop. Tonight, we're opening that cabinet again. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The first thing you need to understand is that this wasn't supposed to happen in America. We tell ourselves that the horrors of extreme isolation, of bloodlines folding back onto themselves generation after generation, belong to distant mountains in Europe or forgotten islands where the outside world never reached. We imagine crumbling estates and deformed royalty, people trapped by tradition and geography. But the truth investigators found was far more disturbing. This happened here, in the valleys of Appalachia, in the hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in places where the roads didn't reach and the census takers didn't bother to go. It happened not because of tradition or pride, but because of something far simpler and far more terrifying, because there was no one else. The investigation began not with screams or scandals, but with silence. In the early 1930s, a young social worker named Margaret Calloway was sent to document families receiving emergency relief during the Depression. Her territory included some of the most isolated communities in Western Virginia, places where the nearest town was a day's walk, and the nearest neighbor might be 3 miles through dense forest. Margaret was prepared for poverty. She'd seen it before. Families living in one-room cabins with dirt floors, children with swollen bellies and vacant eyes, parents aged beyond their years by hunger and hard labor. But what she found in a settlement the locals called Whitley Hollow was something else entirely. The family she was sent to document consisted of 23 people living in 3 connected structures that could barely be called houses. When Margaret began asking questions and recording names, dates, and relationships, she noticed something odd. The family tree she was constructing didn't branch outward the way family trees should. It curved back. It looped. When she asked about the children's mother, she was told the woman was also their father's sister. When she asked about their grandmother, she learned the woman had married her own first cousin, who was also her mother's brother's son. Margaret kept writing, kept asking, kept drawing lines on paper, and the lines kept connecting back to the same 8 surnames, appearing again and again across 150 years. Margaret returned to her office in the county seat and spread her notes across her desk. She documented 12 families in Whitley Hollow, but as she traced the relationships backward through the generations, she realized they weren't 12 families at all. They were one family. One massive, interconnected web of relations that had been marrying within itself since before the Civil War. She found brothers who had married sisters from another set of siblings. She found a man who had children with 2 different women, who were themselves first cousins. She found generations where every single marriage was between people who shared at least one grandparent, and often 2. The mathematics of it made her dizzy. She consulted with a doctor who had studied heredity. He explained what happens when the gene pool becomes too small, when the same genetic material combines with itself over and over. Recessive traits that should appear once in 10,000 births start appearing in every generation. Defects that should be rare become common. The immune system weakens. Fertility drops. Intelligence suffers. And most disturbing of all, the effects compound. Each generation born from these unions carries forward not just the problems of their parents, but the accumulated damage of every generation before them. But Margaret's discovery went beyond genetics. What haunted her wasn't just the medical implications, it was the realization that this hadn't happened by accident. When she interviewed the oldest members of the community, people in their 80s and 90s who could remember back to the 1850s, they told her something that made her blood run cold. The isolation hadn't always been complete. Until around 1870, there had been contact with the outside world. Traders came through occasionally, Young people sometimes left to find work in the towns. But then something changed. The elders spoke carefully, in fragments and half-finished sentences, but Margaret pieced together a story. There had been an incident, a stranger who came through and caused trouble, a young woman from the Hollow who ran away with an outsider and was never seen again. After that, the families made a decision. They would keep to themselves. They would marry among their own. They would protect their daughters from the outside world and their sons from outside influences. What began as caution became custom. What began as custom became law. And what began as law became the only reality anyone could remember. By the time Margaret arrived in 1932, there were people in Whitley Hollow who had never seen a town, never spoken to someone who wasn't related to them, never imagined that life could be any different than the life they'd always known. Margaret knew she needed help. This was beyond anything her training had prepared her for. She brought her documentation to the state health department, where it was passed to a research physician named Dr. Arthur Pemberton. Pemberton had studied population genetics in Boston and had published papers on hereditary illness. When he reviewed Margaret's notes, he immediately understood what he was looking at. He called it a biological catastrophe in slow motion, a human experiment that no ethical scientist would ever conduct, but that had been running unsupervised in the mountains for 15 generations. Dr. Pemberton assembled a small team, a nurse, 2 medical students, and Margaret herself. In the spring of 1933, they traveled to Whitley Hollow with the stated purpose of providing free medical examinations. What they documented over the next 6 weeks was placed in a file that the state of Virginia kept sealed for 47 years. The details only emerged in the 1980s, when a historian researching Depression-era social programs found the records by accident. What she read made her physically ill. Out of 83 children examined in Whitley Hollow, 71 showed signs of developmental delays. 42 had physical deformities, ranging from club feet to malformed palates to skulls that were measurably smaller than normal. 28 were deaf or partially deaf. 19 had severe vision problems, including several cases of blindness. 16 showed what the doctors described as profound mental deficiency, unable to speak or care for themselves despite being 8, 10, 12 years old. The team found a 14-year-old boy with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. They found twin girls, age 9, who had never learned to walk. They found families where every child born in the last 20 years had died before age 5, and yet the parents kept trying, kept bringing new lives into the world, only to watch them suffer and fail. But the physical problems were only part of the horror. Dr. Pemberton noted something else in his private journals, something he was afraid to put in the official report. The emotional atmosphere of the community was wrong. He described it as a collective resignation, a spiritual exhaustion that hung over the Hollow like smoke. Parents who spoke about their children's disabilities with no emotion at all, as if suffering was simply the expected state of existence. Teenagers who seemed decades older than their years, already defeated by a life that had barely begun. And strangest of all, a complete absence of hope for change. When Pemberton suggested that young people might benefit from leaving, from finding opportunities elsewhere, from marrying outside the community, he was met with blank stares. The idea was literally incomprehensible. This was their place. These were their people. This was how life had always been, and how it would always be. The prison wasn't just in their genes, it was in their minds. The team tried to intervene. They really did. Dr. Pemberton returned to the state capitol with a proposal for a social rehabilitation program. He wanted to relocate families, provide education, offer medical care, and most importantly, encourage the younger generation to marry outside the community. He presented his findings to a committee of state officials in the summer of 1933. The meeting lasted less than an hour. His proposal was denied. The reasoning was never officially documented, but Margaret later described what she heard through whispers and closed-door conversations. The state had no interest in acknowledging what had happened in Whitley Hollow. To do so would be to admit that they'd failed to protect their own citizens for over a century. It would raise uncomfortable questions about other isolated communities throughout Appalachia. How many more Whitley Hollows were out there? How many other places where the gene pool had collapsed while the government looked away? And perhaps most damning of all, it would cost money. The Depression was at its worst. State budgets were decimated. There was no funding for programs that served populations most people didn't know existed. So the decision was made to do nothing. The medical records were filed away. Dr. Pemberton was quietly discouraged from publishing his findings. Margaret was reassigned to a different region, and Whitley Hollow was left exactly as it had been found. The people there never knew that anyone had tried to help them. They never knew that their suffering had been documented and measured and then deliberately ignored. They simply continued living the only way they knew how. But here's what makes this story truly unbearable. The isolation didn't end. Through the 1940s and 50s, as America modernized and highways reached deeper into rural areas, Whitley Hollow remained cut off, partly by geography, partly by choice, but mostly by something harder to define. The outside world didn't want them, and they'd learned not to want the outside world. By the time the 1960s arrived, with new laws about education and welfare that should have reached even the most remote communities, the damage was already irreversible. You can't undo 15 generations in a single lifetime. The genetic problems were baked in. The cognitive limitations were permanent. The psychological wounds were passed down like heirlooms. A census taken in 1967 showed 83 people still living in Whitley Hollow. The population had actually declined. Infant mortality was so high that deaths outnumbered births. The average life expectancy was 42 years. And every single person in the settlement could trace their ancestry back to the same 6 couples who had founded the community in the late 1700s. 190 years of the same blood mixing with itself, growing weaker and stranger with each passing generation, until what remained barely resembled the families who had first settled there. In 1973, a fire swept through Whitley Hollow. It started in one of the old timber structures and spread quickly through the connected buildings. By the time the volunteer fire department from the nearest town arrived, 3 hours after the first call, most of the settlement was gone. 11 people died in the fire. The survivors, fewer than 30, were relocated to a group home facility 2 counties away. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Whitley Hollow was empty. The social workers who processed the survivors documented something that still haunts the records. Many of the adults, people in their 30s and 40s, had never seen electric lights before. They'd never used indoor plumbing. They'd never heard a radio or seen a television. When they were shown photographs of cities, of crowds, of the world beyond the mountains, they couldn't process what they were seeing. The images didn't connect to anything in their experience. It was like showing pictures of Mars to someone who'd never heard of planets. One woman, age 36, asked if the people in the photographs were real or if they were ghosts. She genuinely couldn't tell. The psychological evaluations were even more disturbing. The survivors weren't just isolated. They were trapped in a kind of permanent childhood, unable to make decisions, unable to plan for the future, unable to understand consequences. Years of intermarriage had affected not just their bodies but their capacity for abstract thought. They could handle immediate, concrete tasks, feed the chickens, chop wood, plant beans. But anything beyond the present moment, anything requiring imagination or complex reasoning, was beyond them, and mixed in with the cognitive limitations was something else. A deep, bone-level fear of everything new. Every innovation, every convenience, every aspect of modern life felt like a threat. The state tried to integrate them. It failed. Within 2 years, 7 of the survivors had died, most from illnesses their weakened immune systems couldn't fight. The others existed in a kind of limbo, physically present in the modern world but psychologically still living in the hollow. They sat in rooms with heating and electricity and running water, and they were more alone than they'd ever been surrounded by their own family. At least in Whitley Hollow, the world had made sense. Everything was familiar. Everyone was family. Now they were surrounded by strangers in a reality they couldn't comprehend, waiting to die in a place that would never feel like home. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the early 1980s, only 4 survivors from Whitley Hollow remained alive. They lived in a state-run facility, quiet and forgotten, visited by no one. The youngest was 41 years old. The oldest was 67. None of them could read. None of them had ever held a job. They spent their days sitting by windows, looking out at a world they would never understand, waiting for death to release them from their exile. It was during this time that a graduate student named Caroline Pierce stumbled across the sealed medical records from 1933. She was researching rural poverty in Appalachia for her dissertation, and a sympathetic clerk at the state archives pointed her toward a file marked Whitley Hollow Settlement Study, Restricted Access. It took Caroline 6 months to get permission to review the documents. When she finally did, she spent 3 days reading and rereading Dr. Pemberton's notes, Margaret Calloway's interviews, and the medical examinations of those 83 children. Then she drove to the facility where the last survivors were living. What Caroline found there changed the direction of her entire career. She abandoned her dissertation and spent the next 8 years documenting what she called the American Hidden Genealogy Crisis. She interviewed the survivors, recorded their oral histories, and traced their family trees back through county records, church registries, and handwritten Bibles. What emerged was a portrait of generational collapse, so complete that it bordered on the mathematical impossible. She calculated that by the 15th generation, the average person in Whitley Hollow had a coefficient of inbreeding higher than laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic uniformity. They were more closely related to each other than siblings typically are. But Caroline's most disturbing discovery came when she expanded her research beyond Whitley Hollow. She found 7 other communities scattered throughout Appalachia, with similar patterns. Different names, different locations, but the same story. Isolated settlements where families had married within themselves for so many generations that the gene pool had effectively died. Some of these places were even worse than Whitley Hollow. One community in eastern Kentucky had reached a point where no children had been born without severe disabilities in over 20 years. Another in western North Carolina had been quietly abandoned in the 1950s, with the survivors scattered and the records destroyed. The pattern was always the same. Geographic isolation leading to social isolation, leading to reproductive isolation, leading to genetic collapse. And always, the government had known and done nothing. Caroline tried to publish her findings. Every academic journal rejected her work. Too controversial, they said. Too sensitive. One editor told her privately that her research made people uncomfortable because it revealed a truth Americans didn't want to face. That we had allowed our own citizens to suffer and degenerate in isolated pockets while the rest of the country prospered. It was easier to pretend it never happened. Easier to let the lost survivors die quietly and let the settlements be reclaimed by forest. Easier to bury the records and forget. The last survivor of Whitley Hollow died in March of 1994. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Whitley, and she was 68 years old. The death certificate listed pneumonia as the cause, but really she died of displacement, of being the final remnant of something that should never have existed. She was buried in a county cemetery under a simple stone marker. No one attended the funeral, except the facility chaplain and a groundskeeper. Caroline Pierce learned about Sarah's death 3 weeks later and drove out to visit the grave. She was the only person who understood what that marker represented. The end of a bloodline that had circled back on itself so many times it had strangled itself to death. Caroline kept researching. She tracked down descendants of the other isolated communities she'd discovered. Most wanted nothing to do with her. The shame was too deep, the memories too painful. But a few talked. They told her about grandparents who couldn't speak properly, about uncles who never learned to walk, about babies who came out wrong and died within hours. They told her about the silence that surrounded these tragedies, the way families just accepted the suffering as normal. And they told her about the relief they felt when the settlements finally emptied, when the last connections to those cursed hollows were finally severed. By the late 1990s, Caroline had assembled a complete picture. She estimated that between 1800 and 1970, at least 15 separate communities in Appalachia had experienced catastrophic genetic collapse due to sustained inbreeding. The total population affected was somewhere between 800 and 1,200 people across multiple generations. Almost none of them received medical care. Almost none of them were offered help. Almost all of them suffered in ways most Americans couldn't imagine. And when they finally died out, they left behind almost nothing. A few ruined structures reclaimed by forest, a handful of unmarked graves, county records that no one looked at, and a deep, persistent silence. The files Caroline compiled now sit in a university archive. Few people access them. The story of Whitley Hollow and places like it remains largely unknown, even among historians who specialize in Appalachian history. It's too ugly, too uncomfortable, too revealing of failures we'd rather not acknowledge. We prefer our American stories to be about progress and triumph. We don't like to remember the people we left behind in the mountains to marry their cousins and siblings and aunts and uncles until their bloodlines ate themselves alive. But here's what investigators like Caroline want you to understand. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't some medieval tragedy from a distant time and place. The last child born in Whitley Hollow came into the world in 1971. That child, a boy with severe cognitive disabilities and physical deformities, lived until 2003. 32 years old. There are people alive today who knew him, who saw what 15 generations of closed bloodlines produced, who witnessed the final chapter of a horror story that America let happen on its own soil while looking the other way. The hollow itself is still there. You can find it if you know where to look. The foundations of the old structures are visible beneath the undergrowth. Rusted tools and broken pottery scatter the forest floor, and if you're quiet, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes. Generations of voices speaking the same surnames over and over. Parents calling children who share their own parents' names. A family tree that isn't a tree at all, but a knot that pulled tighter and tighter until nothing could breathe, until the bloodline strangled itself, and silence finally came. That's the story investigators never wanted you to know. The one that terrified them not because of what happened, but because of how easily we let it happen, how completely we forgot, and how many other stories just like it might still be hidden in sealed files, waiting for someone brave enough to look.